Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on high performance culture, culture of authenticity. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So if you are new to this, you'll notice that on the left-hand side, sorry, it'll be the right-hand side for you. If you look over on the right-hand side, you'll notice under the question box, could you just open that tab and write in the word clear? That lets me know that I'm being heard. Otherwise, I'm talking to myself, which is not terribly great. So just write in the word clear, that would be great. Thank you. Thanks, John. Anyone else? Thanks, Angela. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Leanne. Okay, it sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. Now, folks, you'll get a copy of these slides and the recording in the next couple of days, probably I'd suggest on Monday at this stage. And so just relax and enjoy the short, sharp presentation for 30 minutes. And let me take you through a process of talking about what the elements are around authenticity in the workplace and what my take is basically on that. So if you've got any questions or any comments or any observations that you'd like to make throughout the presentation, don't hesitate to write them in the question box there. I'm the only one that actually gets to see those. So in other words, I'll see them and I'll respond to them as soon as I get them. Because it's only half an hour, we don't have a huge amount of time at the end for you to ask questions, and often there's an awkward pause at the end when people are thinking about their questions. So just type them in whenever you're ready to go, and I'll respond to them, I promise you, as soon as I see them there on the right-hand side. Okay, so let's get underway. Now, the first thing I should say to you is that this work comes out of my latest book, Bringing the Human Being Back to Work, which pretty much summarises my view, my philosophy, and of course you can see the subtitle there is the 10 performance and development conversations that leaders must have. So that book's available. It's just been released about a week ago, and you're one of the very few people who are going to see the early stages of what's in the book. So well done. Okay, so I'm going to talk about conversations at work, and as you could probably appreciate, authenticity comes from conversations and having quality conversations in the workplace. There are two types of conversations in the workplace. There are task-related conversations and there are people-related conversations. Of course, many are elements of both, but essentially, from what I have observed, probably 80% of our conversations in the workplace are around task, which means that it only leaves about 20% to have people-related conversations. And I think it's the people-related conversations that make the big difference. We'll talk about the 5 pillars of authentic conversation, and I'll share those with you. And as I said before, you'll be one of the few audiences, or one of the first audiences, to actually see what these 5 pillars are. And I will, of course, give you some practical tips as to how you might implement each of those pillars as we go. All right, so let me say a few words about conversations, and then what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit around the authenticity aspect. So in one of my books, Conversations at Work, which was co-authored by Aubrey Warren, we make the statement that organisations are conversations. And if you actually think about it, that's very true. I mean, despite what you might do, at the end of the day, an organisation is a bunch of human beings working towards a common cause. So we can conceptualise organisations as conversations. That organisations are a series of conversations. They go on in the lunchroom, they go in the boardroom, they go on everywhere. And some of these conversations are short, some of them are long, some of them are interesting, some of them are boring, some of them are structured, some of them are unstructured. They're conversations that go on all the time. Some of them meander, some of them are spontaneous, other ones are planned. So organisations are really just a series of conversations going on all the time. So the question that I'd like to pose is, are good quality conversations sadly neglected in the workplace? And I think that's probably true. I mean, how often have we heard of people sending emails to other people in the organisation when they could just simply get out of their chair and go and talk to the person face to face? I mean, that's not always possible, but in a lot of cases it is, and I think people sometimes neglect to do that, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. So I think perhaps quality conversations are on the way in organisations. And we often hear people talk about the art of conversation. I actually don't think it's an art form. The truth of the matter is that we're having conversations regularly, and so we're pretty practiced at it. And to suggest or imply that it's an art form would indicate that perhaps some people aren't qualified to have quality conversations, and I don't necessarily buy into that. I think we can all become good at conversations in the workplace. So the question, I guess, is have we lost the need for conversations? I think not. I think conversations are actually now more important than ever before. And one of the reasons for that is that I think many of us are terrified of AI taking our jobs, but yet in the last 100 years we've become very robotic. You know, we've used systems and processes, we have got KPIs, we've got, we're told to leave our feelings at home and come to work with a rational mindset and so on. So we've been very much conditioned into being very robotic over the last 100 years, and yet now we're concerned about AI taking our jobs. So really, in essence, what we've got to do is reinvent what being human is, what humanness actually is. And humanness is about having conversations. Of course, many people will say to me, and have done so, that we don't have time for conversations. And a person the other day said this to me. He said, Tim, I love your work, I love what you're suggesting, but we just simply don't have time for conversations. And so I found that rather interesting because I'm sure they have conversations. I guess what he's saying is that most of those conversations are task focused, and therefore there's no time to have any other type of conversations. That same individual was worried about why he had a turnover of 25% in his business, and I believe there was a correlation between the turnover and the fact that he didn't cultivate a culture of conversations in his workplace. Two of my colleagues in the United States, Jim Koosner and Barry Posner, who've written many books in this area, claim in a book called Credibility, which is a great book, I might say, but they claim in this book that leadership is a relationship. And I love that phrase, leadership is a relationship. So my question to Koosner and Posner is simply this, and of course it's a rhetorical question, but how do we actually have any sort of relationship with anybody? And of course we're talking about a professional working relationship here, not necessarily a personal relationship. But how do we have those relationships regardless of whether they're professional or personal? And the answer to that is really quite simple. It's one conversation at a time. There's no other way for us to actually build trust, authenticity and engagement than to be having regular, meaningful, quality conversations with the people we lead. So we've got no choice if we really genuinely want to develop a culture of authenticity. We've got to start with the conversations that we have in the workplace. And that's essentially my view in a nutshell. So that's just setting the scene so you can sort of see where I'm coming from and what my view is about conversations and where they fit in to an authentic workplace. So let's now move to the 5 pillars of authentic conversations. And I'll fill out this model as we go through the presentation and use it as the structure. And I'll just go through each of the 5 pillars. And once I've gone through one pillar, I'll give you one little gem of wisdom that you might like to consider when you're looking at creating authentic conversations in your workplace. So, like any pillars that hold up a foundation, each of these pillars are critically important to create an authentic workplace culture. So the first pillar, and these aren't necessarily in any order, but the first pillar that's really important is that we need to get agreement between what our expectations are as leaders and what the people that we lead agree on. So there's got to be an alignment between our view of the world and the view of the world of our people. And the only way we can really do that is through conversation and feedback and the like. So that's one of the pillars. Now, it's quite complex actually, agreeing on expectations. It's not just a simple process. And let me explain that a little bit further. In fact, when you think about managing expectations in the workplace, there are several questions. In fact, in my case, I've got 7 questions that you need to ask yourself when you're working with the people that you lead. The most fundamental and first question is, what are my expectations? Are you crystal clear about what you expect of people? Do you know what the minimum acceptable standard of performance is? In some cases, that would be fairly easy, such as meeting a benchmark, meeting a key performance indicator. But in some of those grey areas, it may not be so obvious. So the first important question is, do you know what your expectations are? Because obviously if you don't, you can't communicate them. So that's the first step. So you need to spend a little bit of time thinking about what your expectations are of the people that you lead. Once you've worked out what your expectations are, the next question you've got to ask yourself is, have I communicated my expectations to my team members? Now, you might say, well, I've done that once in a team meeting, or I've done it once in the corridor with one of my team members. But this is a persistent and consistent form of communication. You must continually and incessantly communicate what you expect of the people that you lead. So that's the second question you've got to ask yourself. Now, if you know what your expectations are and you've communicated them, the next question that you've got to ask yourself is, does the other person or persons understand my expectations? It's all very well for you to have communicated it, but are they crystal clear in their mind about what that expectation really means in terms of the work that they do? And often we assume, of course, that people do completely understand this, but it's not always a good assumption to have. People often don't understand your expectations. So once we've got our expectations, we've communicated them and people understand them, the next important question is, do they accept my expectations? So it's one thing understanding them, it's another thing accepting them. And of course people won't say to you, I don't accept your standards. Sometimes they do, but more often than not, they don't. They say nothing. So we need to be clear, people need to be absolutely clear to accept the expectations that you set. Often I find in workplaces, particularly in sales environments, that we set budget targets so high, and our argument is, of course, if we set them high, then perhaps some people will meet, they'll achieve greater success because they're quite high. But if that person doesn't accept those expectations, then they're highly likely not to meet them. So they have to be able to be accepted by the people that you lead. Then the fifth question is, once they're accepted, the key question is, are they committed to meeting those expectations? And again, we make assumptions that people are going to commit to meeting those expectations. One of the best questions that you can ask with people is the simple question, can I get your commitment to meet this deadline? Can I get your commitment to meet this KPI? Can I get your commitment to lift your game? I think we should be asking that question because that's authentic. We want their commitment. We assume we're going to get it, and it's not necessarily a good thing to assume. So we need to actually ask. And what we're after, of course, is a nod. We want a nod or a grunt or a yes. We want some form of commitment from the person that they're going to make every effort to meet those expectations, whatever they are. But once we've decided that, people need to actually understand, how they're performing against those commitments. Now, that's of course what feedback's all about. So people need to understand whether they've met your expectations or not. And the only way they're going to know that in a lot of cases is for you to actually communicate to them via feedback. So that's the sixth question. And there's one more question, and that is, am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? Now, that's important because there are lots of organisational impediments. There are lots of barriers and blocks that get in the way of people meeting expectations. For example, people not getting information to the relevant person in a timely fashion. That's a roadblock that might prevent someone from meeting a deadline in your team. So your job, of course, is to do whatever you can to support them, whether it's training or paving the way or talking to someone else in the organisation to make that happen. So you can see now that if any of those 7 questions are not answered in the yes, it may well explain why people aren't meeting expectations. So that's pillar 1. So pillar 1 is agreeing on expectations, and of course it encompasses about 7 particular questions. Pillar number 2 in the framework is, am I challenging unhelpful behaviour? Now, people are reluctant to do this because they don't want to open up a can of worms, but the reality is we should be challenging people when they don't meet the standards that we expect, and we need to do that via, of course, conversation. Now, the first 2 pillars here are very task-focused, so these pillars are actually related to the task at hand. The next 3 that I'm going to show you relate very much to the people dimension of what happens. So let's have a look at a little strategy that works really well when you're challenging unhelpful behaviour. This little process is very simple. It's called situation, behaviour and impact, and it works like this, very simply this. So, and I'm just going to read this through to you and you can see how it works. So the very first thing we do is we explain the situation, we describe the behaviour that's unhelpful, and we talk about the impact that that behaviour is having. For example, our regular Monday staff meetings are for sharing ideas and problem solving. So what I've done there is I've spoken to someone about why we have our Monday morning meetings. Then I will go on to talk about behaviour. In the last 3 meetings, I've noticed that you've criticised 4 suggestions that Matthew and Karen raised without offering a possible alternative solution. So you see, now I'm describing the behaviour that is unhelpful. And then I might move into talking about the impact, and I might say, by doing this, you're affecting morale and others may not want to contribute their ideas. Alright, so that's how you use the situation, behaviour and impact, and it works extremely well. But often what we do is we make generalisations about behaviour, such as you have a poor attitude, rather than going through the process I've explained here. And of course that's not going to be well received, and the person's not going to listen to what the constructive criticism is. So the third pillar in the framework is establishing a trusting relationship. So these next 3, as I mentioned, are really around the relationship. So one of the best ways of trusting, or a number of ways of building trust with your colleagues and your team members, and we know from our surveys that engagement and trust is at very low levels in organisations. So we as leaders have got to work even harder at this, and we can't just assume that trust is there. That's a very dangerous assumption to make. But a couple of things to keep in mind. It's important to treat people fairly. Okay, irrespective of whether you or I might like somebody, the reality is we should be treating them fairly. Not only should we be treating them fairly, there should be a clear perception that we're treating people fairly, which is a little bit trickier than just treating people fairly. We need to recognise their positive contributions, and people do make positive contributions, and often what happens is that we don't take the time to have a conversation with them to let them know that we're really happy with that contribution that they've made. So for example, they may have spoken to a customer who has been quite demanding, and they've kept their cool and they've managed the situation extremely well. Well, that warrants you having a conversation with them to explain that you were really happy with the way they kept their cool and the way they communicated with the customer. Give people clear directions. People want clarity. And in the world that we live in, where it's very topsy-turvy, we need to give people crystal clear sense of direction of what we're doing. And that's important. And go back to those 7 questions that I mentioned earlier. We need, of course, to support their development, and I think most people understand that now, but it's very important to continually do that. And it may not be about sending people off to training courses necessarily. It might just be to have encouraging conversations or, conversations around how people might be able to do things better, faster, easier, or what have you. And of course, the whole theme of this webinar is to be authentic. And I guess if you do those four things, there's a reasonable chance that you're demonstrating what authenticity really is in the workplace. Are there any questions at this stage? Anyone, any comments, any observations? By all means, type in your question and your comment. I'll be happy to respond to it. While you might be thinking about that, let's continue. The fourth pillar in the framework is to show genuine appreciation, and I think I've just touched on this earlier. We need to show more appreciation, and if you look at surveys again, all over the world, across 21 industries, we find that people will criticise their leaders for not showing genuine appreciation. Key word in there is genuine. Now, what's the quickest and fastest and most effective way to show appreciation? Simply this. Just say thank you. I don't think we are saying thank you enough for the work that people do. This is, of course, when they exceed your expectations. Thank people for staying back an extra hour. Thank people for completing the report under pressure. Thank people for juggling a number of priorities. Thank people for dealing with an irate member of the public. So just get used to saying thank you more, and you'll find that that will be well received. In fact, no one will actually criticise you for saying thank you too often. Okay? Well, no one will actually come up and say, stop saying thank you to me. They won't do it. They appreciate it, and rightly so. So that's the fastest way to show genuine appreciation. And don't hover around there waiting to see what the reaction is. Just say thank you and move on. The final pillar in the framework is building for the future. Now, the only reason that you're having usually an authentic conversation is because you're trying to either reinforce behaviour that's occurring so that it continues and it's a pattern of behaviour for the future, or the only reason you're having a conversation with someone is because you want to make sure that you nip in the bud that behaviour that's unhelpful. That's the only reason we're having a conversation. We can't change the past, but all we can do is learn from it and then start to modify behaviour for the future. So that's the fifth pillar. And the key message I'd say here to you is exactly this. And I don't know where this statement came from, but I love it. Learn from the past. In other words, the past is about learning. You can't change the past. Once it's happened, it's happened. And often people will talk to you about the past. But once they do that, a key question that you can ask people is, what was the key message you got from that situation? Live in the moment, which is what that whole mindfulness movement is all about. So we need to be living in the moment because it's the only moment we've got to live in right now. Right now is the only moment we've got to live in. So multitasking and all those sorts of things, as we know from research, don't actually work. So give everything you do 100% and 100% concentration. And of course, the key thing about the future is to plan for it. And this is something I think you could train your team members to think about, to learn from the past, to live in the moment and plan for the future. And that makes things work out pretty well. So there's the 5 pillars in this short, sharp broadcast. Agree on expectations, challenge unhelpful behaviour, establish a trusting relationship, show genuine appreciation, and build for the future. Now, they're not all separate conversations. They're just pillars that you can use in the variety of conversations you have, particularly the people-focused conversations I mentioned. So the first 2 are really related to task, and the last 3 are very much related to people. But both, of course, are important in any workplace that we work in. All right, so that probably brings us pretty much to an end. Does anyone have any questions, comments, observations? Now's your final chance to post a question, and I'll be happy to respond to it. Okay, maybe while people are thinking about that, one thing I'd like to say to you before we finish up is that I know many of you have been involved in my Lunch and Learn series over the past couple of years and got some tremendous feedback from it. I've got some tremendous feedback from it, which I really appreciate. So Lunch and Learn is an online series of workshops based around a theme. Now I've got one coming up in November too, and some of you may have done a Lunch and Learn, but I don't think, looking at the list, any of you have completed this one, which is around developing high performance teams. And you can see over on the left hand side the units that are covered. So each of those is a unique broadcast of 1 hour. You get the slides, you get the recording, you have time with me on email to discuss what's going on in your workplace. You get an opportunity to complete a diagnostic in there as well on conflict. And if you, just a one-off offer, if you come back to me today with an email, I will give you a 10% reduction on the $295 that it costs to register someone in the process. So that's a little offer that goes from today. So if I get an email from you by the close of business today registering an interest, I will make sure that you get a 10% discount on the recommended price. So folks, that's pretty much it for me. Thank you for the opportunity of working with you. Thanks, Angela, for the feedback. That's great. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for your feedback. Thanks, Leanne. I really appreciate that feedback. Thank you very much. Thanks, folks. That's been very kind of you to register that. I've still got a couple of free webinars before the end of the year. Just go to my website and you can register for those. So that's pretty much it for me. So thank you, everyone, and I wish you a wonderful weekend. And I hope next week is a great opportunity for you to practice authenticity even more so than you probably are. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.